Great. Okay, everybody. So I want to thank you guys for joining me today. Today is actually a really, really important day. I know that before we went on break, some of you had, in the younger grades especially, learned about the terrible things. And you watched a video about a bunny and some of his forest friends. Some of you did this last year as well as this year, but for those who don't know the story, it begins with a narrator who describes a beautiful clearing shared by various animals. And the animals lived in peace for a really long time until one day when the terrible things came in. And the terrible things claimed that they came after creatures with feathers on their back, and one by one, every animal that did not have feathers excused themselves. The terrible things saw the birds on top of the tree branches and caught them with nets they brought with them and took the birds away. Out of fear, some animals tried to see the positive side and said that they never really liked the birds. Only the bunny had the courage to ask what was wrong with having feathers, but it was urged by Mama Rabbit to remain quiet and be grateful that the terrible things didn't come for them. Life continued just as before without the birds until one day the terrible things came back, looking for creatures with bushy tails. Just like before, every creature tried to excuse themselves. The squirrels tried to hide from the terrible things, but they were seen and then caught with the same nets the birds were caught. Then the squirrels were taken away by the terrible things. Just like before, the remaining animals tried to fool themselves by claiming that the clearing is better off without the squirrels and their noise, and Mama Rabbit urged the little one to remain quiet and be grateful the terrible things had left them alone. Then the terrible things came for the creatures that could swim, and they took away the frogs and the fish that lived in the little stream in the clearing. Then the terrible things came for the porcupines, and the only creatures remaining were white rabbits. The little rabbit tried to convince Mama Rabbit to leave the clearing, fearing that they would be next. Mama Rabbit insisted, saying, stay where they were, claiming that no one could harm them. However, one day, the terrible things came back for every creature who was white. Only the little rabbit managed to escape, hiding behind a rock. After he realized he was alone, the little rabbit decided to leave the clearing and go warn the other animals about the terrible things and the animals they took. Now, I want you guys to imagine this today. Imagine how you would feel if the terrible things came and took away anyone with brown hair or brown eyes or anyone who wears glasses or anybody who's Jewish. How does that make you feel? How would you feel? Avery?
I would probably feel upset because my family would be taken away.
Yeah, upset would definitely be one of those feelings. Who else?
And
Harry. Oh, Zach.
I feel like a little scared because like they're like coming to come and take us because we're Jewish and stuff.
Peter actually put in the chat, he said sad. Absolutely sad. Those are all the right feelings to have. Yes, Chase.
I feel very angry.
Angry. That's another good feeling that you would have. These are all the right kinds of emotions to feel about something like that, because people shouldn't be differentiated from one another because they don't look the same or they don't believe in the same faith. So now let's think about if those terrible things came for you. Oh, who wrote? Somebody wrote, I would feel like there are some dumb people around. Well, you know what? There are some people who would say that. So, you know, I can't discount that. But I want you to think about this. I want you to think if maybe those terrible things were to come for you. And what would you do? Would you go quietly and do as they said? Or would you stand up and fight back? How many of you would just go with the terrible things and not even ask why? That Harry, you would just go. Why?
Probably just kill me if I tried to fight back.
Well, okay. Ariel said I would just run away. Okay. Avery, Zoe, look, be the one of you.
So I would probably, I'd probably try to escape them, but once they caught me, I wouldn't move because they could hurt me. Because they're bigger than me. I would probably do neither of them. I would probably do in between. I would run away from them and hide.
Okay.
Well, they
Keep them in the ground.
That's not helpful. Okay. How many of you would fight back? Chase has his hands up. Finn has his hands up. Michael. Okay. So you know what? Oh, Zach, you would fight. You know what? So this is actually great because that's kind of what we're going to be talking a little bit about today. So I'm going to actually share my screen here for a second. I'm going to ask you guys a question. Now, for those of you that are in the Hay class, you're already going to know this because we talked about this during our Holocaust curriculum, but what does it mean when I say the word resistance? Anybody know what that word means? Harry?
To fight back, to resist something.
To fight back. Okay, what Jonah said, I would run before they saw me because I would not be able to fight back. Okay. All right, so I'm going to put up my screen so we can see this right there. Okay, so resistance, similar to what Harry said, is refusing to accept or comply with something, an attempt to prevent something by action or argument. Right, so you're really sort of you're pushing back against whatever it is that someone's asking you to do. A lot of times when we think about a day like today, right? Today is called Yom Hashoah in Hebrew, Holocaust Remembrance Day. We think about Jews who were taken to concentration camps where terrible things happened to them. And while many were forced out of their homes and into ghettos and were torn apart from families and had to fight for their lives, some did decide to resist. And there were two different kinds of resistance. There was cultural, spiritual type of resistance, and there was active, armed resistance. Does anybody know what the difference is? Finn?
Spiritual, they might like protest or like something like that, and for the other one they might do it like violently. Okay,
you're absolutely right. Let me put my chat up here so I can see. There's a lot going on. Where are they off the chat? Oh, here we go. Okay, learning about the Holocaust right now in school. Were you really, Jonah? You're the only person who said that to me all day today. Good for you. Yes, Chase.
You asked me that same question.
What?
That was I learned about Holocaust in school.
And you said no.
Bad teachers.
Yes. Okay, before I go on, Ariella, did you have your hand up?
I just wanted to ask that if one of the things the Jewish people did, if they caught them, then could they like just decide to like just change their religion so to become Christian, and they'd let them go?
You know what? That's an excellent question. And there were some people who did try to do that. We get into a lot more of this when you get a little bit older because there's a lot more to the story than the little bits that you're going to get here and there. But there were some people who didn't care whether or not you changed religions. If they could trace your history back to having any ancestors that were Jewish, you were considered Jewish, and they didn't like that. So it didn't always work to people's benefits, but there's a lot more to some of these stories. Avery or Zoe, one of you guys have your hands up?
Yeah, so I was gonna say the difference between physical and like non-physical, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So non-physical would be like using words, like saying like no to them, and like Finn said, protesting. And physical would be like fighting with them, like violently, and like you could like have like armed weapons.
Okay, so it's very easy to define what armed resistance is. We all know what that is. Harry, go ahead.
I think if they tried to protest, they wouldn't survive very long, because I don't think the Nazis would care what they're saying. They would probably, I think violent protests probably worked out a bit better against them.
Okay, so let me just show you guys what the difference is. I will put my screen on and we'll get to in 1 second, Chase. So here you guys could see my screen, and you can see in the picture right over here, you can see, what does everybody recognize right away in this picture? Zach.
There's a menorah right there and a key.
There's a menorah right there, and you can also see that a lot of these people are wearing a Star of David, which is what Jews had to wear at that time to identify themselves as being Jewish. So cultural spiritual resistance is their way of attempting to maintain their previous way of life, like lighting Shabbat candles or Hanukkah candles while in hiding when they really weren't allowed to do that anymore. So that's the kind of spiritual cultural resistance that we're talking about. Then we have the other resistance, which everyone seemed to get right away, which is active armed resistance. And here you can see men in uniform with ammunition, and those are the resistance fighters that used violence and weapons to get their messages across. So these are the two types that we're dealing with. And as I said, as you go through our program, as you get older and more mature, we add a little bit to the story every year until you get to the Hay class, when we really tackle a lot of these subjects in a little bit more detail. So today, we're actually going to hear a story about Paul's parents. This is Paul Goldstein, our guest speaker today, who were part of the Jewish resistance movement that are known as the Partisans, and what they did to survive the Nazis and the Holocaust. But before we do all that, there's something that we do here every single year. Each year, we hold a candle lighting ceremony, and we've got several families here with us at LEV Academy who have had relatives who were part of the Holocaust. So every year we read those names and we light a candle in order to honor those who survived and remember those who did not. And so we're going to do that right now. And I'm going to put this up on my screen while I do this so that everybody can see what I'm doing. And I'm going to light our yahrzeit candle right here. Okay. So I'm trying to see who I have on my screen here really quickly. You know what, Finn, you're like right front and center. Can you do me a favor and just read that slide for me?
Sure. Blessed in the match consuming and kindling flame, blessed in the flame that burns in the secret fastness of the heart. We light these candles for the light that shines in the hearts of all who fight against evil. For a single candle can both defy and define darkness.
Thank you. Wonderful. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing this for a second, and I'm going to read the names of those family members that are part of our community who shared their family's information with me. Unfortunately, Max is not here with us today, but for his family, it's David, Malka, Chaya, Peril, Cyril, Razel, Lavish, Mayor, Moishe, and Sender Morgenthaler all perished in Treblinka. Yehuda, Chaya, Leah, and Shmuel Langer perished in Poland, and Rose and Mordechai Morgenthaler survivors. For Max Hetherington, who is also not here with us today, that was Hannah Magram and Benjamin Magram. Benjamin never made it to the camps. He perished along with his family in his home. For Josh Kahan and the Kahan family, Josh's great-grandmother, Helen Kahan, is a survivor of Auschwitz, and will be turning 97 next month. And then we've got Chase right here, right? For our family, it's Malvina Cole Weiss, Elizabeth Weiss, Abigail Weiss Freund, David Julius Weiss, Julius Arpad Freund, all gassed in Auschwitz, Bushke Weiss, Imre Weiss, Joja Weiss Freund, and Malka Weiss Lovi, Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen survivors, all of whom have since passed. And then we have the Smolin family for Ariella. That was Sirla Gold Pal from Auschwitz, Josef Pal, Auschwitz, Shmuel Pal, Gross Rosen, Rufla Pal, Lodz Ghetto, Lucia Pal, Chelmno, Salma Pal, Mauthausen, Sala Pal, Auschwitz, Nachman Pal, Auschwitz, Deborah Pal, Auschwitz, Machel Halperin, Auschwitz, Lila Blima Halperin, Lodz Ghetto, Eliash Halperin, Unknown, Sarah Halperin, Auschwitz, Leisure Hirsch Halperin, Auschwitz, and for our teacher, Lori Fibus, we have Lionel Roth. Okay, and so I'm going to okay. So before I call on Rabbi Shebelowitz, who's going to say a couple of words, I just want to give a moment to a quick video that I just want to play for you guys that is going to just pay a small tribute to those who had passed in the concentration camps. Just share my screen, share sound. Rabbi.
Yeah, thank you.
You're there?
Huh?
No, go ahead. I'm going to just...
Thank you. I was very impressed by that last video, so I'm just sort of taking that in. All right, guys, so here we are once again. And for some of you, I've seen you here for 4 or 5 different Holocaust programs, like growing up in our Hebrew school, and the newer students, younger ones I see now. And we always at our temple have tried to make it a very important day, because it is a very important day. It gives us an opportunity not only to memorialize those people in our families who were affected, but to understand exactly what happened. And we're very lucky that we are still living in a time where there are people that can come and speak about it, because it happened so many years ago. It happened before I was born. And I would look around and say, I think I could say that for the rest of you. It happened before we were all born. And yet there are some people who are here because their parents were involved in the Holocaust, and they are still here and able to tell the stories that they heard from their parents. Last year, I don't know if you guys remember, we had Dr. Jerry Bagel, who talked about it. And I still think almost all the time about the words that he said that he got from his mother about different things in the Holocaust. So listen now, because this is the time when we are still here to be able to talk about it. I think that maybe by the time you guys all grow up, and I hope I'm very wrong, and as you guys get into be like my age, God willing, who knows who will be around to speak of such a thing, because it happened so long ago. Okay, and we have that opportunity. You guys have that opportunity that there are still people and Hebrew schools and individuals, like we have Mr. Paul Goldstein over there, who's going to speak to you guys, who make it their business to come on and to talk about something, which who knows in another 40 years if the word will even be known. So I hope so. I hope so. But if not, that'll be a tragedy. But you guys will be able to say that, you know what, when I was a young kid in Hebrew school, a young person in Hebrew school, I heard about it. And I heard from somebody who talked about it, who talked about his parents who were directly in it. We're listening to Inbar, whose grandmother was in the Holocaust and was in the concentration camp, and she always talks about it, which it makes us very, very lucky in some way that we have a person who, unfortunately, her grandmother went through this, her family went through this, but able to speak to us and set up programs for this. So listen today, because you're having a unique opportunity to hear something which hopefully it will be said many years from now, but maybe not. And so you could all just say that you still heard about it. Do you want me to say Kaddish? Say Kaddish? Okay, I'm going to say the Kaddish prayer. I never give this over to Inbar for some reason or another, either just it doesn't, but I'm going to say a prayer for my family today as well. I'm going to include that. And I'm going to say Kaddish in memory of my mother's father, Benjamin Fass, who was able to come to this country before World War II, before Hitler, from Poland, from Krakow, Poland. And even though he wanted to, he could never go back to Poland, because he was told that if he did go back to Poland, chances are he would never be reunited with his family in the United States, because Hitler would probably kill him somewhere along the line. And so he never went back. And he was the only person who survived from his entire family, because he was here. And then one day, miraculously, my father found, by accident and a miracle, found my mother's cousin, or my grandfather's nephew, in Europe, who had gone through the concentration camp. And just a miracle that they found each other. Was a fluke. And we were able to bring him to the United States. So 2 people out of a family of probably at least 100 people, I'm going to say Kaddish for. We have no idea where they perished, but we're assuming most perished in Auschwitz. So death unknown. And so I will say Kaddish for them and for all of your relatives as well. And let us pray for their souls, and let us listen to Mr. Goldstein today, because again, this is something which is so very special that we have the opportunity to hear this today from him. Okay, so I will say the Kaddish in memory. Yiskadal v'yiskadash shemei rabbah, b'yomah divrach hirutei, b'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon u'v'yamechon u'b'chayei dechol beis Yisrael b'agala u'b'zman koriv v'imru amen. Yehei shmei rabba mevorach li'alam u'lamei omaya. Yisparach v'yishtabach v'yispa'ar v'yisramam v'yisnaseh v'yishadar v'yishaleh v'yishalal shemei d'kudisha barichu le'ela min kol birchasa v'shirasa tushbachasa v'nechemasa da'amiram v'yalma v'imru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya v'chayim oleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav hu yaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Okay, so now I'm going to introduce our speaker to everyone. In his bio to me, he writes that the fear that many survivors of the Holocaust have when they are gone is that their stories will be gone. Those who grew up in the shadow of the Holocaust, the children of survivors, make the Holocaust more than a fading story. They are a living testimony to the hopes, dreams, and ideals that their parents and grandparents embodied. I'd like to introduce you now to Paul Goldstein. 4 years ago, on Yom Hashoah, Paul was asked to speak with his congregation about his family's heroism and struggle for survival during the Holocaust. He was so moved by the impact his story had on the members of his congregation and on him personally that he now continues to speak to schools and other organizations as a personal tribute to those who survived and those who died. Paul's parents cheated death in Nazi-occupied Poland. His mother was involved in the uprising and later escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto. His father not only fought with the partisans and on the Russian front, but heroically escaped from Treblinka, where his action helped to change Holocaust history. Over the past 4 years, Paul has given presentations on his family story to about 10,000 students and adults. Please give your undivided attention, please, to Mr. Paul Goldstein. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you all. Just want all to understand what a second generation survivor is, and that's what I am. I'm the first generation of Americans who grew up with parents who survived the Holocaust, and here we are. So hang in there for the next half hour or so, and I will tell you their story and how their life during the Holocaust affected me. So I'd like to thank you all for letting me present my family story. And occasionally during the presentation, you're going to see a blank slide. That's intentional. There's nothing wrong with the connection. So Imbar told you that I began to speak at my own congregation, and that really moved me. But there was another occasion that occurred. When my son was in high school, he asked my father, who was a Holocaust survivor, to speak with his classmates about his experiences as a Jew in Nazi-occupied Poland. And there again, I saw how moved the students were, and I promised myself that one day I would continue to tell the story of our family so that no one would ever forget what happened and what could happen if hatred goes unchecked. So as a second generation survivor, I'm committed to ensuring that the stories live on to be known by each successive generation, you guys. And if not me, who will speak for them? If not you, then who will know? Most of the information, photos, and videos in the story I'm about to share with you are actual testimonies from my parents. Their testimonies are memorialized in institutions like the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and Yad Vashem in Israel. And some of the testimonies are from my father's recently found handwritten accounts. Several of the photographs you'll see were smuggled out of Poland, hidden in shoes, undergarments, and the linings of my parents' clothing. Still others were researched and added for historical perspective. So I'd like to start by asking all of you a simple question. How would you define what a hero is? And I can't see all of your faces, so Inbar, can you just moderate that?
I'm going to just enlarge my screen over here. Oh, we've got a lot of hands up. Ariella.
A hero is someone who helps other people. I mean, who helps other people.
Yep, good.
Yep. I'm just going across my screen. Harry and Zach, one of you guys have your hands up?
A hero is like maybe doing something for a person or sometimes saving a person's life,
Okay.
helping a person to improve theirs and your life.
Okay. Who else had their hand up? Avery, Zoe.
Yeah. When you're helping someone else, not yourself.
Right.
Okay. Finn?
A hero is when you put others before yourself.
Excellent. All very, very good answers. Let me see if anybody else has their hands up that I can see. Mason.
A hero would be someone willing to risk their life to save someone else's or to help someone else.
That's great.
Yep. And Ariella put in the chat that she also knows that not all heroes wear capes, which is absolutely true.
That's exactly. I was gonna say something just like that, because when you think of a hero, you think of someone who's larger than life, like Superman or Batgirl, or But I found this quote online, and I really think it defines what a hero is. It's an ordinary person who makes themselves extraordinary. So according to the author of this quote, we all have the capacity to be a hero. For me, the key to heroism is acting out of concern for those who are in need, even knowing that you're at great personal risk, and doing this without any expectation of reward. By that definition alone, my parents were extraordinarily heroic. Life is practice. You are practicing to be who you want to be when you get older. If you want to be known as dependable, you have to act dependably. If you want to be a person, if you want people to trust you, you have to be trustworthy. If you want to be a hero, you have to do something heroic. So think about how you would be a heroic during your lifetime. Today, I'm going to share with you the story of what it was like growing up with my parents who survived the terrors of the Holocaust. I ask you to think about what this could mean to you and your family. My father and my mother were ordinary people who faced extraordinary circumstances. They are my heroes. I first learned of my parents' ties to the Holocaust when I was about 4 years old. One morning, jumping into bed with my parents, I noticed a foot-long gash on my father's calf on his leg. And I believe he consciously had tried to hide this and other wounds he had suffered from his children, me and my brother. When I asked him what it was, I could still remember a long pause and a worried look on his face. My father showed me other wounds he had suffered on his neck and in his hand, and he told me how he had the strength and courage to actually dig out a piece of metal from a bullet in his hand with a razor blade without any anesthetics. And while some survivors never spoke of what he saw and endured, from that point on, my parents made a point of telling me their stories with more descriptive detail. They explained why out of 60 or so family members, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and countless cousins I could have had, only 2 survived. The rest were all murdered in Treblinka. So I want you to think about this. During the Holocaust, over 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were murdered. That represents 2/3 of Europe's pre-World War II Jewish population. And out of that 6 million, 1.5 million were children. But how can you put that number into perspective? Well, think about this. If you were silent for each of the victims of the Holocaust, we'd be silent for 11.5 years. Or 6 million is equivalent to about 3/4, 75% of the entire state of New Jersey's population. My parents, Sam and Sabina, were from Poland. My father came from a rural town called Kozienice. In Poland, my father's father, my grandfather, was learned in Torah, and he was the Baal Tefillah, the prayer leader in the town's synagogue. When my father came home from religious school, he was trained to make shoes and other leather items of clothing. He couldn't have known then that his shoemaking skills would one day save his life and change the course of Holocaust history. How could he? He was only 20 years old at the time. That may seem old to you, but it's actually old, not very old for someone who's doing something as heroic as he did. My mother was born and raised in Warsaw, which was a cosmopolitan city, a very cultural city, which was known as the Paris of Eastern Europe between World War I and World War II, because it had a very vibrant cultural life. My mother's father, my other grandfather, was a government official, and they lived well in a city home. Although they were not very religious, he also was learned in Torah. Immediately after the war, they were interred in the Lodz ghetto, that's in Poland. In 1949, they tried desperately to immigrate to the United States. But when they learned the quota from survivors were filled for Poland, they purchased documents, false documents, proving that they were born in Germany. Somehow, they managed to book passage on an outdated freighter ship called the Marina Tiger. That's actually the ship that they arrived in America on. Conditions on board were horrible, and many people got sick. My father's brother, Uncle Max, left Poland before the war and sponsored my family's entry into the United States. He helped my father get a job, leveraging his skills as a shoemaker in a factory in the Lower East Side of New York City, where he was paid by the piece. And what that literally means is for every shoe that he finished, he was paid a few pennies. My mother, father, and brother shared Uncle Max's small apartment in Brooklyn, New York. When I was born a few years later, my parents could only afford a modest apartment. My brother and I shared the only bedroom, and my parents slept in the living room. Around that time, my mother's only surviving sibling, who we lovingly called Tante Genya, Aunt Golda, was sponsored by my parents and brought to the United States. Many of my parents' friends, all Holocaust survivors, settled in the same neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York. All of them had lost loved ones, so that they became our family and we theirs. They took the place of my lost aunts, uncles, and cousins. Looking back to those early years of my life, I could say that they were the most loving people I ever met. They were generous and kind to a fault. Whenever I entered their homes or they visited mine, I felt almost overwhelmed by the love that they exhibited. Nobody took more joy from my mere existence. Nobody hugged me harder or kissed my cheeks with greater joy. But growing up with parents who survived the trauma of the Holocaust and immigrated to the United States presented many challenges that children of American-born families don't face. Here are some examples. When I was about 4, my mother and I were riding the New York City subway when she believed she saw a former guard from her concentration camp. She quickly grabbed my arm and we escaped the train just as the doors were closing. When I look back at that incident, I can see now how scared she was. Once, against my father's wishes, I wanted to join the Boy Scouts, which I think is a fine organization. The meeting was held in a church. Being Jewish, I'd never been in a church before. Somehow, my father tracked me down and literally dragged me out of the meeting. My disobedience was so abhorrent, I'll use a big word, abhorrent to him, disagreeable to him, that he said, it's not bad enough that you disobeyed me and sat in a church, but you dressed in a uniform that looked like you are part of the Hitler Youth. Now, the Hitler Youth were a group of children, 12 years old, 10 years old, 14 years old, who were trained by the Nazis to be soldiers. And if you look at the two different uniforms, they look almost exactly the same. The only difference is the flag that they're carrying. When it came to helping me with homework, my parents could provide very little assistance. Once when I was in elementary school, and I'm sure all of you did a project just like this, we went on a trip to the Brooklyn Museum of Art, which you see right here. And we were asked to write a report and read it aloud the next day to class. Who among you have done a project just like that? Just raise your hand quickly and let me know. I think we all did, okay? So I reviewed the story with my mother, and after all, she was wise and I was just 7 years old. And the first line of the story read, yesterday we went to the Brooklyn Museum of Art. And my mother said, no, the word is not museum, it's museum. Museum. She just learned the language a few years ago. When I presented the story to my class, I was greeted with laughter. I couldn't even get past the first sentence, and as a result of that, I was so ashamed, I promised never to ask my parents for help again with my homework. My parents worked hard all their lives, providing what they could so their family could survive. Education was the most important thing to them. They came to the United States with not a penny in their pockets, but somehow helped my brother and me get through college and earn advanced degrees in our chosen fields of study. My mother didn't start working outside of the house until my brother and I were in high school. She worked in the New York City library system, a skill she attained in Poland. After my father's shoemaking career, he tried his hand running laundromats, selling children's clothing, working as a real estate broker, a cab driver, none very successfully. But regardless, the life skills he learned to survive the Holocaust served him well. He was the bravest, most determined, stubborn, and defiant man I ever met. To say that my parents' lives was changed by the Holocaust would be an understatement and disrespectful for all those who survived and all who died. It was September 1st, 1939. My mother had just returned from vacation with her girlfriends when her father delivered the sobering news in Yiddish. Wir sind gekommen mit Deutschland. We were at war with Germany. A year later, she and 7 of her family members were forced to leave their spacious home and were ordered to relocate to the notorious Warsaw Ghetto, where they all squeezed into a tiny 1-bedroom apartment. In total, over 400,000 Jews were sent to the Warsaw Ghetto. That's just a little bit more than the total population of Newark, Trenton, and the town that you lived in, crammed into an area of about 1 square mile. Living in such appalling, overcrowded ghettos, Jews were routinely deprived of basic necessities like heat and food. Many died of starvation and disease. Ghettos were surrounded, as you see, with high walls and barbed wire like a jail, so no one could get out. You had to wear an armband or a patch which identified you as Jewish. If you were over 12 years old and caught without one, you could be shot by a Nazi. In the ghetto, a friend helped my mother obtain a work permit to prove her usefulness. She had to prove that she was useful to the Nazis, to the Reich. So she began to work in the makeshift children's hospital. Now I'd like to introduce you to my mother, who's going to tell you in her own words what it was like to be in the children's hospital in the ghetto.
Then again, arised another problem. You had to have a pass that you are working to be useful. Others than going to the library, I didn't know anything. And then again, Mrs. Fishman,
that was a friend of my mother.
You know what? I'm going to make a place for you to work in the children's hospital. That was a small hospital on Shiska.
The street.
And you're going to be working there. That was not a paid job. It was only a protection that you are useful. And I used to go 5:30 in the morning together with my father. He obtained a little clerical job in the Judenrat. My hospital was in that small ghetto. We had to pass such a checkpoint when the Germans are standing and watching. Do you have a pass? Do you have to go from one ghetto to another? Going with him, I was shivering because many times they took these Jews and made fun of them, had the ball, beat them up. And that's what happened sometimes to my father too, but we had to go to work. While leaving the apartment early in the morning, plenty of corpses laying in the street, stark people walking around. Not a better picture waited me in the hospital. Children, swollen, deformed faces. You couldn't even see the eyes of the children. And if you would push your finger into it, it is just like dough which was risen on with yeast. Or you stick a pin, you would see a geyser of water pouring out. And slowly, these kids didn't eat. And many times in the morning when I came, the bed which was occupied was empty. The child died, or it died on my hand or on another nurse's hand.
So let me ask you all, how did that discussion my mother just had with you about the children and the children's hospital and what happened to her when she went to work, how did that make you feel?
Avery.
Really sad.
Yep, sad.
Phillips boys.
I'll go first. Touched. Yeah, me too. I'm feeling the same way.
Okay.
Touched. Finn.
Horrified.
Horrified.
Okay.
I'm just going across my screens over here.
Anyone else?
You know what? It's very interesting that you said horrified, and I know it's not a word we generally like to use, but if you're not even a little bit horrified or disturbed, then we're not getting our point across, because it's absolutely correct. It is horrifying, the conditions that some of these people had to experience. So everything you guys have said, right on the money so far.
Exactly.
Yes.
Is there someone else, Imbar?
Just scroll here. Nope, I think we're good.
Okay. So I think my mother would have agreed with all that you said, and also that taking care of others during these terrible times, especially little children in the ghetto hospital, gave her a sense of purpose and a glimmer of dignity when all basic human necessities had been taken away from her. When my mother wasn't fighting for the lives of ghetto children, she fought in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Now, this was a part of the story she really didn't share a lot with me about, but we do know that young women like her, she was a teenager at the time, she was 19 years old, built explosives, destroyed train tracks, provided news to the inhabitants of what was going on during the Holocaust. Some of them even killed Nazi soldiers. The uprising was a bold act of Jewish civilian resistance against the liquidation of the government, the ghetto, by the Nazi oppressors. Liquidation meant burning it to the ground, killing thousands of people and sending the inhabitants of the ghetto to the Treblinka death camp. The uprising began on April 19th, 1943, 80 some odd years ago, when about 750 young men, women, and teenagers, armed with black market and stolen pistols, rifles, hand grenades, and fuel bottles, attacked the heavily armed German forces. The uprising lasted for about a month. My mother was an ordinary woman who did extraordinary things. Time and again throughout her life, she demonstrated a strong sense of intuition. You know what that means? She could almost feel and think about what was going to happen next, and that guided her in making death-defying decisions. Somehow she managed to escape from the ghetto. She was determined to stay with an aunt in another town where she thought she'd be safer and possibly send food back to her family in the ghetto. As Germany's suppressions and atrocities in Poland were intensifying, she attempted to return to Warsaw by hitchhiking and hiding in the woods and Jewish homes, but she didn't succeed. She was captured and sent to a slave labor camp. What she didn't know was that all of her family members who'd remained in the ghetto had been selected for deportation by cattle car to the Treblinka death camp. She never saw them again. When my mother was captured, she was sent to the Skarżusko concentration camp, where she performed slave labor, making arms, bullets, rifles, munitions for the Nazis. She told me how women in her camp slept 6 to a bunk on a hard wooden plank and a flimsy bug-infested straw mattress, and how she survived a typhus epidemic, a disease that's spread by lice, Now I'd like to introduce you again to my mother, who's going to tell you a little bit more about her experiences.
It was on a Sunday morning, and the Germans came to our houses wherever we stood. There's few people, it wasn't too many. Rouse, rouse, rouse. And we had been packed on lost autos again. Where are we going? Trucks, probably, yes. I probably would know how to say it, but it's... Where are we going? We don't know. I remember sitting on that truck and a Ukrainian was sitting near me. I wore a watch. He said to me, give me that watch and you will be free, I'll let you go down. And I said, oh no, I'm going with my people and you're not going to get a watch. They brought us to Skorzysko, where some people of Kozienic had been there already. There probably was a selection. Some went to the wagon, some went to work. We marched into Skorzysko. At that time, they didn't ask me to give away the watch. They took the watch. When we came back on the night shift, to pass by these Ukrainian guards, it was another hell. You had been beaten, you have to run, they pulled out people suddenly for their fun. And we had been happy already being back in the barracks. Then a typhus epidemic, an epidemic of typhus. Very bad one, people died. People had been hungry, didn't have what to eat, work, bleeding, that's all brought to it. I myself got sick with the typhus. I was burning up with 104 temperature, laying like this and being really condemned to death. I was thirsty. I wanted to drink. I was burning up. It was like maybe a crisis night. And I would say that Providence brought my hand down to the end of that long. I'm coming to a terrible thing. And there was standing a tin can. The can was usually with urine. Yes. And I must say that I drank it. I drank it not knowing what I'm doing. But I was very thirsty. And it happened to be that was like a medicine to me. It was maybe the crisis, or maybe that dream, or maybe that drink. I woke up in the morning and my temperature dropped.
So again, I'm going to ask you all, how do you feel about what you just heard? Amber, I can't hear you.
No, I know I was having trouble getting off mute. What do you guys think? I mean, that's a pretty drastic thing to have to do when you're sick, but you're really, really thirsty. What would you guys have done? Would you have done the same thing? How does that make you feel hearing what she just said? Chase, you want to answer?
You're so confused.
You feel confused?
Yes.
Why confused?
How would a drink cure you?
How would a drink cure you? I don't know. Maybe there's something in it that really worked. I don't know, but it thankfully it definitely worked. Avery, Zoe.
I didn't quite hear. Did the soldiers give it to her, or did she take it?
She took it herself. If they found her sick and she could not perform work, she probably would have been murdered. I know it's pretty yucky to think about what she did, but I think, when you're faced with situations where it's life or death, and it was in this situation for her, you do things which you have to do to stay alive. At least that's what I think.
Yeah, remember when I told you guys to think about, if the terrible things would come to you, what steps would you take? How far would you go to try to protect yourself, to protect your family? Sometimes you had to do really, really, incredible things in order to make it through another day. And this is a great example of exactly that.
Okay, let's move on. In January 1945, okay, why am I think I lost my screen here. Hold on. There we go. In January 1945, the Allies invaded Nazi-occupied Poland and liberated the concentration camp where my mother was. She, her best friend, and my aunt left the camp and trekked for more than 2 weeks to the town of Kozienice, would have been called the coldest winter ever. Ironically, surviving that walk to Kozienice led her to meet my father, who came there for the same reason, to look for surviving family members. My father, too, faced extraordinary circumstances. His hometown, Kozienice, had a vast forest of pine and birch trees that surrounded the village. In the summer, people would vacation there to breathe the fresh air and lounge in the lakes and the waterfalls. But once the Germans occupied Kozienice, my father knew it was time to leave. He tried to convince one of his sisters to go with him, but she chose instead to stay and take care of their elderly parents. It was a fatal decision. After he left town, my father joined the Polish underground called the Partisans. The Partisans lived and hid in the woods, which were dangerous places filled with wolves and other savage animals and German snipers. Like my father, he never saw his family again, as one day they were all transported and died at Treblinka. More on that in just a little bit. Twice the Nazis captured my father, and he escaped both times. Once he daringly just walked out of a slave labor camp when the guards were asleep. I asked him if the guard dogs barked during his escape. He explained that he saved the little amount of food that he had, the rations that he was given, to feed the dogs so he could slip past them so they wouldn't bark. The second time he was captured was when he journeyed home from Kozienice after fighting on the Russian front. He could never have predicted that the entire ghetto of Kozienice, his hometown, including him and his family, would be packed into cattle cars and sent to Treblinka. Oops. Treblinka was an industrial killing complex. It housed 2 different concentration camps, a slave labor camp and an infamous death camp where about 1 million Jews who were deemed undesirable, according to Nazi racial standards, were gassed upon their death. My father never told me or my brother that he had been sent to Treblinka. I was shocked to find this discovery in his personal handwritten notes, which I just found this past September. My father often spoke at a memorial service for the Holocaust, honoring those who died from his town. After he passed away in 2005, I found 80 handwritten pages about his experiences during the Holocaust, folded in a manila envelope inside his tallis bag. From time to time, I glanced at them, although I never fully read them because I had heard all the stories before, or so I thought. For some reason, last September was different. Something compelled me, drove me to read them completely, line by line, description of his many tragic stories. One of the stories just astounded me. Here are some excerpts from that story. On September 27, 1942, the Nazis ordered all Jews in my hometown to assemble at 5 a.m. in the town square on Targova Street. Me, my parents, and my sister didn't leave as ordered. The soldiers burst into the house and shot my mother. They dragged my father by his beard and paraded him through the streets. We were all packed into cattle cars and sent to Treblinka. In all, 13,000 people from Kozienice and surviving towns were herded into these cars. Many died before they even arrived. When they arrived, few were chosen to sort clothing. I would labor from dawn to dark with little, and if I made any little mistake, it carried with it the threat of death. The remaining were sent to their deaths. These were silent men, women, and children who days before were productive members of society. Doctors, musicians, teachers, laborers, shopkeepers. In this register provided by the Radom Museum, the Radom is a town in Poland, which lists the names of the people sent to Treblinka. You could see on these 2 pages, if you look to the far, as you look at the screen, the far left, the names of my family members. You see Pinchas Goldstein, my grandfather's name, Shmuel Goldstein, my father's name. You see his mother's name and his sister's name on this page. But next to their names, if you look all the way over to the right side of your screen, at the top, you'll see a red stamp. It's kind of vague, but you could see the red stamp. And the date that's branded there is 27 September 1942. And besides the words are this. I can't pronounce Polish words, but I did take those words and I put them into a Google translator. And what they say is population movement control number 1823. That was probably the number of the train. Displaced in an unknown direction. Unknown? Really? They didn't know where they were going? My father goes on to describe a decisive Jewish revolt in Treblinka that he was central to. The date was July 28, 1943. The Jews who worked in the camp were divided into groups, each according to profession. After 5 months of sorting clothes, this is quoting him, I became a shoemaker. I was able to stay alive by making boots for German officers and shoes for their wives. More and more people were dying of disease, hunger, or killings. With the situation getting worse, we knew we had to do something or we might be the next ones to die. We formed several planning committees and each of us had a vital role in creating the uprising. Some of us disabled tanks and severed phone lines. Some of us stole hand grenades and rifles and hid them. On that day, a camp officer ordered me to take his measurements for a new pair of boots. While taking his measurements, another man came from behind and killed him. Outside, a torch was raised, and that was the signal to begin the revolt. All of the barracks and watchtowers were set afire. Our fighters attacked with machine guns and hand grenades. The camp was burned to the ground and the gates were open and everyone was free to go where they wanted. But where could one go? Estimates vary, but there were about 1,000 Jewish prisoners who participated in the Treblinka revolt. 700 of them died during the revolt. The remaining 300 fled into the woods. Most of them were recaptured or died from disease or starvation. Some of them went on to resist the Nazis. Of the original 1,000, somewhere between 40 and 90 survived. 5 came to the United States. My father was one of them. My father was an ordinary person who made himself extraordinary. I share this extraordinary story with my children so they would know of their grandfather's heroism. I never heard about the revolt in Treblinka. Doubtful, I searched it online, and except for a minor discrepancy in the date, it was just as my father described. But discovering this extraordinary story was merely the starting point. After sharing the story with one of my sons, he showed me a book he had purchased in a thrift shop several years ago called Treblinka by Jean-Francois Steiner. Knowing that so many of our family members had died there, he found the book too painful to read, but I did. Amazingly, I found that the author confirmed everything my father's handwritten story. The author even describes a vital role of the revolt played by a shoemaker named Simic Goldberg. My father's Yiddish name was Shmulik Goldstein. The similarities just seemed too close for coincidence. Well, at the beginning of the book, the author had indicated that the names of the people had been changed to protect them from any survivors, any of the Nazi survivors who wanted revenge. The book was published shortly after the Holocaust. I was hungry to find out if the character Simic Goldberg was indeed my father. Through a Facebook group I belonged to, I obtained the author's name, phone number, and mailing address in France. I phoned him 3 times. When my voice messages went unanswered, I mailed him a real letter in the mail, not an email, but I provided him with my email address and a picture of my father in his cobbler shop from the mid-1960s when the book was published. Less than a week later, he replied, not only did he confirm that, yes, Simmer Goldberg was my father, but he also remembered meeting him. He called him one of the Jewish heroes of Treblinka. I have since confirmed my father's activities at Treblinka with two other reliable Treblinka historians and authors. The question remains as to why my father never told his children about his heroic story. Though I have several suspicions on the matter, I'm afraid the truth went to the grave with him. I do have some ideas, which maybe we could talk about later if time allows. But what I can say as I reflect on this amazing discovery is that my father was the epitome of a hero. He was an ordinary person whose actions made himself extraordinary. The heroic story of my parents' lives and survival is a testament to their cunning, courage, and quick thinking. Recounting their lives gives me some understanding of the improbability and the painful choices that led to their survival. It's hard not to think about the bare margin that separates survival from death, the decisions made in a flicker that accounts for one's existence. While some of the Holocaust survivors never recovered from the trauma of genocide and couldn't find happiness again, my parents chose to live a life well measured and were thankful for every little thing they had. I never asked my mother how a woman who survived such horrors could remain such a bottomless source of warm-heartedness. My mother was beautiful, charismatic, charming, and very creative. She loved to write in her spare time and had a voice that rivaled many professionals. When she sang at my brother's bar mitzvah party, the band leader asked if she'd like to join the band. My parents' story truly speaks to mankind's strength of spirit. Both fought for their lives and survived under the most unspeakable conditions. Though growing up with unimaginable deprivation, constant malnutrition, rampant disease, and subhuman sanitary conditions, they lived well and thrived into their 80s. Their determination to live was an expression of their instinct to survive. Their presence was so full of life. My parents didn't carry the burden of pain and horror and death that they experienced personally on a daily basis. Instead, they chose to bring light and joy into the world, most importantly, creating a family as a legacy to so many people who we had lost as relatives. Some years ago, my parents took my brother and I back to Poland. My mother longed to find her childhood home in Warsaw. My father wished to pray in Warsaw's only surviving synagogue, and they wanted to pay respect to our family who was murdered in Treblinka. On Saturday morning, we visited the Nojic Shul. We found it in a state of shambles. Windows were shattered, prayer books were ripped, pews were broken. Nonetheless, the few faithful Jews who remained in Warsaw after the war continued to congregate there that day for worship, as we did. When the prayer service ended, my mother insisted we try to find the house she grew up in. She was always aware, and she had, as I mentioned earlier, this great intuition. She swore her house was still standing. Walking through the streets of Warsaw, it was in 1988, we were surprised to find that much of the city, which had been destroyed during the war, had not yet been repaired. But there among the frames of bombed out buildings and piles of brick and wood and rubble stood one building. Unbelievably, it was my mother's house. I was very concerned about how my parents would feel on returning to their childhood homes. What would be the impact of the memories they were reliving, especially when we visited Treblinka. When the Nazis realized they were losing the war, they destroyed the Treblinka death camp and other concentration camps to erase any evidence of the atrocities they had committed. What remains now of Treblinka is a symbolic cemetery scattered with these stones that look like a graveyard. At the top, you see a picture of my mother standing by her hometown stone, which says Warszawa in Polish, and the one below is Kozienice, my father's town. Speaking to the question that Imbar asked earlier about cultural resistance, I often wondered how God could allow the Holocaust to happen. When I asked my father at that gravestone, he replied, "We were religious people and we believed that God would save us. More of our people should have fought for themselves and their families. They never did." My father left a broader message for succeeding generations, which rings true today. He warned pre-war Germany was an advanced, educated country with a democratic constitution, free speech and rule of law. At that time, it had the most Nobel Peace Prize winners in the world. It would be comforting to think that Nazism just happened. It didn't. The study of the Holocaust helped us to look back and see where the warning signs were, where they were missed, where the consequences were ignored, and where waves of prejudice existed and propaganda prevailed, as it still does today. We owe it to the victims and the survivors to look back, to remember the 6 million Jewish men, women, and children who were murdered, to remember also the several million Soviets, gypsies, homosexuals, criminals, disabled, and political prisoners who were victims of systematic extermination by the Germans during the Holocaust, to reveal the horror of their deaths, and to acknowledge that most of all, we were silent citizens of the world and we failed them. We cannot fail them again through ignorance. We cannot fail them again by forgetting. We cannot fail them again by denying the persistence of anti-Semitism and hatred of any kind and allowing people to deny that the Holocaust ever existed. So students, I ask you to think about this and think about how you can become a hero. I ask you to make it personal, to get acquainted with the stories of the individuals who lived through this reign of terror and whose lives were cut short. Learn not just what happened, but what failed to happen to stop and prevent the Holocaust. Be accountable, because anyone who is a do-nothing bystander and doesn't speak out to confront hatred is guilty as well. You know, using language, which you may hear now in schools or on the streets or in jokes on some of the social network platforms, to characterize individuals as groups or as different or undesirable is a persuasive way to dehumanize people. Language is just one example how each of us has the power and responsibility to act in the face of hatred, but we can't bear that critical experience and responsibility alone. So students, I ask you all to make a vow, a promise to confront hatred and never let this happen, starting right here in your school, in your community, in your home, and among your friends. As a child of Holocaust survivors, I learned what it feels like to be targeted simply for who you are. I learned the deadly consequences of hatred, whether it's called anti-Semitism, racism, bullying, fat shaming, or something else. I learned what people are capable of when hatred goes unchecked. So I strive to promote the compelling and enduring values my parents taught me. Cherish every moment in life because you never know when it might end. Love your children because they are the precious link to preservation and continuity of family. Never forget where you came from and stand up for what you believe. Most of all, don't be a do-nothing or a complicit bystander. And finally, I ask you to never forget my parents, Sam and Sabina, ordinary people who survived and thrived in the face of extraordinary circumstances. Be their voice and continue to tell their heroic story. Thank you very much for listening. So right now, I'd like to ask you to please raise your hand or stand up if you're ready to do something, to be a hero, to do something extraordinary, and to stand up against hatred.
That's amazing. I wish I could get everybody on one screen, but I can't. But I see every single person's hands up, which is absolutely amazing. We are very, very proud of you. And I just want to say, I know that this is not an easy story to listen to. None of them ever are. I am obviously much older than you are. And every story I hear affects me exactly the same way. I don't think you ever get used to hearing these kinds of stories. And it should bother you. It absolutely should bother you. So if that's the feeling that you got, if you are disturbed by what you heard, then your feeling is absolutely correct. It gets a little bit easier to navigate this as you get older, but I don't think anybody will ever be able to truly understand what these people went through. And, Paul is absolutely correct when, he says what we always encourage you guys to do here in Hebrew school, and that is to be an upstander. Who can tell me what is an upstander? Zach.
Standing up to people and like saying what you think of, like maybe standing up to people and like being strong.
Eli.
Seeing someone doing something bad and going against them and defending the victim.
Right. If you are in school and you see somebody being bullied and you don't say something, you are a bystander. You are standing by and watching something bad happen to someone else. If you are an upstander, you're the one that goes and gets the teacher or the principal or another adult, and you tell them, this kid is being bullied and needs help. That's the difference between being an upstander and a bystander. And sometimes it's really, really hard to be an upstander because you're really putting yourself out there to help someone else. And sometimes you don't know if that person's going to want to take something else out on you. So you're really putting yourself out there and putting their feelings ahead of your own. But it's so incredibly important to do. The other things that we never want to see any of you guys do is become a perpetrator. And that is somebody who is starting fights or bullying or hurting somebody else because they don't look like you, they don't think like you, they don't share the same religion as you. Those are all things that a perpetrator does. And unfortunately, that's what leads us to being victims. The people who are the recipients of all of that kind of bad behavior are the victims. And you can clearly see that in all the stories that we share every year from our survivors, from survivors' children, from the Terrible Things allegory, the movie that you saw. The bunny tried to be an upstander. He tried to warn people, but people didn't listen. And that is exactly what happens in the real world all the time. And we don't want something like this to ever happen again. So as you get older and more mature, obviously we will continue to do our part here at LEV Academy to give you guys the background that you need. But more importantly,
can I interrupt for 1 second?
Yeah, absolutely.
My father told me the story, and it's also in his writings, that several people from a variety of different concentration camps escaped and went back to their hometowns and tried to warn the people there what was going on in the concentration camps. And as my father said, those people were thought of as being mashuga, crazy, because they thought, how could anything like this ever happen? People didn't want to believe that it could happen to them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a very difficult thing to wrap your head around. And that's why I've always believed that as difficult as some of these, stories are to hear, I think it's really, really important that we tell them and that we tell them often, because you never want to get comfortable with what it is that you hear. And as I said, we will continue to do our part here at LEV Academy. As you guys get older, you get a little bit more information. It'll never be something that will be easy for you to take in, but it will help give you a lot of direction as you get older and to be very aware of what goes on in the world around us today in 2022, because there are still some people out there who don't like us simply because we are Jewish. And it's wrong, and we should never accept that. So you guys all took that oath to be those heroes, to stand up for yourself, to stand up for others. And you are our legacy. You're the ones that are going to continue these stories and are going to continue to make sure that something as horrible as this never, ever happens again. So thank you. I want to thank you, Paul. Do any of you guys have any questions that you want to ask? Now's the time to do it. Chase, you have a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Oh. Why do people blame us just for being Jewish?
Well, that's a great question and has a wide variety of different answers. But let me just put it, I'll try to make it as easy as possible. Why do people dislike people? You know, there's no reason for why people specifically dislike or dislike people. Some people just don't have the facts, the truth. They don't know the truth. Some people think every Jewish person is rich, so they don't like that. They think every Jewish person controls the media, what's on television, the social media, what's in the newspapers. That's not true. But you know, these rumors begin, and then they begin to grow and grow, and the lies, people tell lies and they grow and grow. It happens in our politics, which I won't get into, but it happens in our politics. And you know, when people tell a lie, that lie is just out there, and you can't get rid of it. It's out there in space. People have heard it. Now some people are going to believe it, but if they know the facts, that's the important thing. As long as people know the truth, then you can always do away with, with those lies.
Yeah, that's why it's also very important that we understand what a stereotype is, and understanding what is truth and what is not. And as I said, as you guys get older, when you get to the class that the rabbi and I co-teach, we really go into a very in-depth discussion about stereotypes, and what the history of anti-Semitism is, how we got to that point in history where the Holocaust was even allowed to happen, and what the world's response was to things like that. And these all come with time, but the important part is for you to be very aware of what goes on around you, and that when people tell you things, that a lot of it comes from a place of not knowing a lot of the times. I was just asking earlier, and then Jonah had said that they were actually studying the Holocaust in school, which I was really happy to see, because when I asked my own kids, and I have one son who's 10 and another who is 17, and they both told me that they haven't done anything, and none of it was even mentioned in school. So for a lot of people, a lot of the information that you get, and sometimes the only information that you get, is from programs like ours here at LEV Academy, which is why we're always so insistent that you listen to these stories, sometimes as difficult as they may be to hear. Eli.
You said that this sort of hatred was caused by lies, but do you know who started the lies and why they were started?
Well, if you remember when we started the program in Hey Class, one of the very first videos that I showed you was the history of anti-Semitism in Europe. And it sort of went through what happened, way back when with, the beginning of Christianity, and how all that sort of just, manifested itself and just became stories that it's almost like a game of broken telephone, where somebody said something to something and then it gets twisted around until you end up getting this. But people have always needed a scapegoat. Who knows what a scapegoat is? My Hey Class kids should know this. Eli.
It's something used to kind of not have to face reality.
Yeah, it's someone or something that you use to blame for something, even though you don't have any basis for doing so. So Jews have been scapegoats for centuries for so many things. Germany, and many of you have never gotten to this point in history, but Germany was not happy after World War I. They were in a lot of financial trouble. They were looking for someone to tell them that things were going to be okay. And Hitler promised them all of that. And he said that all of Germany's problems were the fault of Jews, because they controlled the banks, they controlled the media, they did all these things, none of which was true in the way that he put it. But people needed something to rest their hopes in. And he was a very good speaker, and managed to convince millions of people that his way of doing things was the right way. And unfortunately, millions of innocent people lost their lives because they believed what he said without any background, without any real knowledge as to what was really going on in the world. And it's sad, and I hate to almost say it, but it still exists in the world today, which is why the Holocaust, even though it was 77 years ago, is still so incredibly important and relevant to our lives today, especially when you hear people say that it never happened. So it's absolutely devastating. Anybody else have any other questions? No other questions? Well, I have to give you guys a lot of credit because this was definitely not an easy story to listen to, but an important one at that, and you guys handled it really well. Yes, Avery. Zoe, sorry.
I'm just wondering, how can we control, like, how to make sure, like, the Holocaust, like, doesn't start again?
Well, that is a really, really great and mature question. How can we ensure that the Holocaust never happens again? Well, I think what you're doing today is a really, really big step. Listening to the past helps you really understand what happened and what should not happen again in the future. If somebody goes and says to you, I can't be your friend because you're Jewish, and you ask them to explain why, and they say to you something like, well, you know, Jews are, I think you had it up on a slide, Paul, it says, Jews are responsible for COVID, or, you know, Jews are responsible for all these things, and you sit there and you go, but wait a minute, that's not true. I learned my history, and let me just tell you, this is what really is, a lot of it really comes down to education, and just always, always learning about the past and seeing how you can apply it to the future. And it's something that we kind of build upon here at LEV Academy as well. And most importantly, be that upstander. Stand up when you see something, report it, tell an adult. If you're not sure about what to do, you are always, always welcome to reach out to me, to any of your teachers, to Rabbi Shebelowitz, to any adults, and we will always, always find a way to help you to make sure that we can continue to make people aware of what's going on so that we can truly live up to the saying, never again. Rabbi, did you want to say something? You're on mute.
I was muted. Okay, so I say that I agree strongly with what you said. Your questions were very good to Mr. Goldstein. I thought that that was right on point, why people don't like us and things like that. Again, I think you were very, very lucky that you were able to hear something today, which who knows, you know, as you guys grow up, there'll be people that will be able to tell these stories anymore, as I said before. So, you know, this is recorded, right, Imbar?
Yes.
I can actually see this. I would, if there's a way you could, you guys are computer geniuses, most of you anyway. So if you could find a way to save this, what went on today, and keep this for yourselves, it would be something to have in your future. That's something when I was your age, I wasn't able to keep anything. We had no technology. We had to write everything down. So we couldn't see anything. So you guys are lucky. If you guys can find a way to just save this today, that would be fantastic to you. And glad you were able to be here. And we'll see you next week. Thank you.
Just want to finish quickly by just saying, let me just change this over here. So today is a really, really sad day, as we all know. But 3 years after the end of the Holocaust, Jews had a miracle happen. Does anybody know what happened 3 years after the end of the Holocaust? I got to scroll over here. Anybody have their hands up? I can't see. Well, we're going to actually be talking about this next week. So 3 years after the end of the Holocaust, we hoped and prayed, and our wishes came true because the state of Israel was born on May 5th, 1948. And now Jews have their own homeland, the land that we were promised centuries ago in the Bible. And next week we will be celebrating Yom HaAtzmaut, which is Israel's Independence Day, with a really fun program. But we never end any of our programs on a sad note because we always want to have that feeling of hope. So I'm going to hand this off to Maura Sherry, And I will put up on my screen here the words so that everybody can see them. Maura Sherry is going to lead us in the Hatikva. So those of you who know it, please stand and join her.
Join.
Well, all of you should know it because we've gone through it all the way from Aleph, all the way through Hey. So.
Nice.
Thank you guys so much for your attention, for your questions, for your insights. This was absolutely fabulous. Paul, thank you so much for your time and for speaking with our students. This was absolutely wonderful. As the rabbi said, this was recorded. It will be in our YouTube playlist under Holocaust speakers. We keep all of them. So if you ever needed to go back and do any research, or you're interested in learning more about other people's histories, we have them available to you. And as always, we are always here for all of you. I will see you all next week for Yom HaAtzmaut, where we go back to having a little bit of fun now that we understand why we have so much to celebrate. So have a wonderful weekend, everybody, and I will see you all next week.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Good job, everybody.
Yep. Everyone was wonderful with great questions.
Yeah.
Amazing.
What time is this, the adult part?
7:30.
7:30. All right,
Yep.
very nice. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. See
I
you.
will see you in a little bit.